The air in the study was thick with the smell of old paper and regret, a scent I'd come to associate with my father's pronouncements. He leaned back in his leather chair, the afternoon sun glinting off his spectacles, a Mona Lisa smile playing on his lips. "You know," he began, his voice unnervingly soft, "sometimes the smallest kindness can have the most far-reaching consequences." I knew that tone. It was the prelude to a carefully orchestrated demolition, usually delivered after I'd done something he deemed a transgression against his meticulously crafted order. My transgressions, more often than not, involved genuine human connection, something he seemed to view with the suspicion of a seasoned spy. My mother, on the other hand, was a creature of spontaneous affection, a trait he tolerated like a mild allergy, managing it with a constant stream of subtle control. Our life, on the surface, was the picture of suburban stability: clean house, good schools, polite smiles exchanged over garden fences. But beneath the veneer, it was a performance, and my father was the director, my mother the unwilling star, and I, the reluctant understudy. He'd always had a knack for making me feel like an inconvenient variable in his grand equation, a glitch in the system that needed to be smoothed out. I remember one Christmas, a few years back. My Aunt Carol, perpetually down on her luck, had come to stay for the holidays. She'd brought a small, slightly lopsided gift for me, a hand-knitted scarf in an unfortunate shade of mustard yellow. I'd thanked her warmly, genuinely touched by the effort. My father, watching from the doorway, had given me a look that spoke volumes. Later that evening, after Aunt Carol had retired, he'd called me into his study. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he'd picked up a crystal decanter of brandy and poured himself a generous measure. "That scarf," he'd said, swirling the amber liquid. "A truly choice of color. You know, darling, presentation is everything. It reflects on all of us." He'd taken a sip, his eyes fixed on me. "Next time, perhaps a more discerning acceptance would be appreciated. For everyone's sake." It wasn't just about the scarf, it was about his control, his need to curate every interaction, to ensure that nothing deviated from his vision of perfection, a perfection that always seemed to exclude genuine emotion. He was a man who believed in the power of appearances, and any deviation was a threat to his carefully constructed world. Then there was the time my best friend, Sarah, had gone through a particularly brutal breakup. She'd shown up at our house, mascara streaks down her face, a mess of tears and raw grief. My mother, bless her impulsive heart, had immediately pulled Sarah into a hug, murmuring words of comfort. My father, who had been engrossed in his newspaper in the living room, had let out a barely audible sigh. Later, as Sarah was leaving, he'd intercepted me in the hallway. "You realize," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper, "that sentimentality is a luxury we can't always afford. Encouraging such displays, while perhaps well-intentioned, can be detrimental in the long run." He'd tapped the side of his nose. "Discretion, my boy. Learn the value of discretion." It wasn't that he was heartless, not entirely. It was that his heart was encased in a fortress of logic and control, and any emotional leak was a potential breach. He saw vulnerability as weakness, and he was determined to protect his family, and himself, from its perceived contagion. He taught me that a well-placed silence could be more devastating than any shout, that the most effective punishments were the ones that left no visible scars, only a slow, gnawing emptiness. The annual summer fete at the country club. A sea of pastel dresses and crisp linen shirts, the air alive with polite laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. It was my parents' element, their stage. My mother, radiant in a flowing floral gown, was circulating through the crowd, a vision of effortless charm. I'd spotted her near the silent auction tables, engaged in conversation with a man I'd never seen before. He was older, with a silver mane and a boisterous laugh that carried over the ambient murmur. They were standing a little too close, their heads tilted towards each other. I'd felt a prickle of unease, a familiar tremor of something being off. My father was across the lawn, deep in conversation with Mr. Henderson, the club president. I debated whether to approach my mother, to offer a polite interlude. But before I could, she did something that made the world tilt on its axis. She laughed, a bright, uninhibited peal, and then, impulsively, she reached out and hugged the stranger. Not a polite peck on the cheek, but a full, warm embrace, her arms wrapping around him for a good, solid moment. It was a gesture of genuine, uninhibited affection, the kind I rarely saw directed at anyone outside our immediate, tightly rolled family circle. In that instant, the hum of the party seemed to fade. The laughter of others sounded distant, muffled. I saw my father's head snap up. His eyes, usually so calm and appraising, narrowed. He excused himself from Mr. Henderson mid-sentence and began to walk, his gait measured, deliberate, towards my mother. The stranger released her, and she turned, her face flushed with a joy I hadn't seen in years. Then she saw my father approaching. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable, a mask of polite observation. The stranger, oblivious to the sudden tension, smiled warmly. "Lovely to meet you," he said, extending a hand to my father. My father shook it, his grip firm. My mother, now sensing the shift, looked between them, a flicker of apprehension clouding her eyes. And then, my father, his gaze fixed on the stranger but his words clearly intended for my mother, delivered the fatal whisper. It wasn't shouted, wasn't even loud enough for the stranger to hear, but it sliced through the air, sharp and precise. "Don't ruin it yet," he murmured, his voice laced with a chilling undercurrent of possessiveness and veiled threat. The stranger beamed, still unaware, and turned back to my mother, launching into another anecdote. My mother, however, seemed to shrink. Her smile faltered, a shadow passing over her face. She shot a quick, anxious glance at my father, and I saw it then, the absolute, terrifying control he held. The hug, the spontaneous moment of connection, had been instantly recontextualized, not as an expression of joy, but as a potential disruption to his meticulously managed peace. The drive home was a study in manufactured normalcy. My mother was unnaturally quiet, her gaze fixed on the passing lights. My father, in the driver's seat, hummed a tuneless melody, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I sat in the back, the stranger's booming laugh and my father's chilling whisper echoing in my head. The phrase, "Don't ruin it yet," replayed like a broken record, each iteration amplifying the suffocating weight of my father's possessiveness. It wasn't just about the hug. It was about his perception of my mother's independence, her ability to connect with others in a way that didn't involve his approval. He saw her warmth as a potential contagion, a threat to the sterile environment he cultivated. The next morning, the house felt different. The usual polite breakfast ritual was strained. My father was his usual self, reading his financial paper, occasionally offering a curt remark. My mother, however, moved like a ghost, her eyes downcast. I saw her fiddling with her wedding ring, her movements jerky and uncertain. I watched her, a silent observer, as the events of the previous night settled in my gut like a stone. The casual intimacy of the hug, the stranger's genuine warmth, my mother's brief moment of uninhibited joy, it had all been snuffed out by a few whispered words. It was an act of exquisite cruelty, a power play disguised as a paternal admonishment. And in that moment, something shifted within me. The simmering resentment, the years of silent endurance, coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. I would not let this stand. Not this time. I spent the next few weeks gathering information, a detective in my own home. I accessed my father's personal laptop, a violation of his strict privacy rules, but a necessary one. I knew he managed all the family finances, meticulously tracking every penny. I discovered a separate, offshore account, meticulously hidden, used for investments and speculative ventures that he never disclosed to my mother. It was a secret nest egg, built on years of her contributions to their joint assets, now solely for his future, excluding her entirely. I meticulously documented every transaction, every deposit, every withdrawal. I copied encrypted files, cross-referenced them with public records, piecing together a picture of his financial maneuvering, a betrayal far deeper than any clandestine embrace. Then, I turned my attention to my mother. I found her old journals, tucked away in the attic, filled with a youthful optimism that had slowly, painfully, faded. I read about her dreams, her aspirations, all of which had been systematically dismantled by my father's pragmatic indifference. I learned about the inheritance from her grandmother, a substantial sum that she had, at my father's insistence, invested in his business ventures early in their marriage. Those investments had long since paid off, yielding significant profits that had seemingly vanished into his private accounts. The legal framework was complex, but I found a brilliant, discreet lawyer who specialized in marital assets and hidden wealth. We worked in tandem, a silent conspiracy of justice. I provided the evidence, she provided the legal strategy. The plan wasn't to confront my father with anger, but with irrefutable fact. It was about stripping away his illusions, not just his wealth. The day of reckoning arrived unannounced. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other. My father was in his study, engrossed in his usual routine. My mother was out, running errands. I had arranged for the lawyer to meet me at the house at precisely 11 a.m. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. The doorbell rang. I opened it to find the lawyer, a woman with an air of quiet authority. We sat in the living room, the air thick with anticipation. Exactly at 11:15 a.m., my father emerged from his study, a cup of tea in his hand. He saw the lawyer, his brow furrowed in mild irritation. "And who might this be?" he asked, his voice laced with his usual condescension. The lawyer introduced herself, her voice steady and professional. My father, assuming she was a potential client of mine, offered a patronizing smile. "I'm afraid my son isn't involved in legal matters," he said, turning to me with a dismissive wave. This was it. I stood up, my heart thudding, but my voice was unervingly steady. "Actually, father, she's here for you." He paused, the teacup halfway to his lips. "For me? I don't recall making any appointments." The lawyer opened her briefcase. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout or accuse. She simply presented the documents, laid out in meticulous order. There were spreadsheets, financial statements, court filings, and a preliminary injunction. "Mr. Davies," she began, her gaze direct, "my client, your wife, has initiated divorce proceedings. We have substantial evidence of marital asset dissipation and hidden financial interests that will be presented to the court." She slid a folder across the coffee table. "This includes proof of offshore accounts, undisclosed investments, and a clear pattern of financial misconduct. We are seeking full disclosure and equitable division of all assets, including those you have attempted to conceal." My father's face went through a series of subtle, but profound, transformations. The initial irritation melted into bewilderment, then disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, darted between the documents and the lawyer, then to me. He reached for the folder, his hand trembling slightly. He leafed through the papers, his breath catching in his throat. The color drained from his face. The smug assurance, the air of infallible control, evaporated like mist in the sun. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a raw, unadulterated panic I had never witnessed before. It wasn't just the financial ruin, it was the exposure, the shattering of his carefully constructed facade. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, by his own son, using his own methods of precision and quiet execution. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustle of paper as his world crumbled. The aftermath was a symphony of chaos, played out in hushed tones and frantic text messages. My mother, initially stunned into silence, slowly began to weep, not tears of despair, but of a dawning, fragile relief. The whispers started almost immediately. My father, desperate to control the narrative, enlisted his sycophants, the men who had always bowed to his perceived power and influence. Flying monkeys, I called them in my head, dispatched to gauge the damage, to try and mend the torn fabric of his reputation. My father's brother, Uncle Robert, a man whose own life was a testament to my father's generosity and manipulation, called me first. His voice, usually jovial, was strained. "What in God's name have you done, son?" he'd stammered. "Your father is devastated. This will ruin him." I simply told him the truth, concisely and without emotion. The details were all there, laid bare for anyone who cared to look. My mother's sister, Aunt Eleanor, a woman who had always been subtly envious of our family's supposed perfection, was less direct. Her calls were filled with passive-aggressive inquiries about my mother's well-being, veiled accusations about my recklessness, and subtle attempts to gather ammunition for my father's defense. She spoke of loyalty, of family ties, of the importance of maintaining appearances. I ignored her, letting her words dissipate into the ether. My father tried to fight, of course. He unleashed his expensive lawyers, but they were fighting a losing battle. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. The whispers about his hidden wealth and his manipulation of my mother's inheritance spread through the country club like wildfire. Suddenly, the polite smiles turned to averted gazes, the warm handshakes to cold nods. His social standing, his most prized possession, began to crumble. The man who had built his life on appearances found himself exposed and ridiculed. His carefully curated world was unraveling, thread by thread. He was ostracized, a pariah in the very circles he had so meticulously cultivated. There was no grand pronouncement, no dramatic confrontation. Just a inexorable descent. The legal proceedings concluded with a settlement that left him financially crippled, stripped of the wealth he had hoarded for decades. My mother, for the first time in years, seemed to breathe freely. The weight of his control, the unspoken fear that had permeated our home, had lifted. She began to rediscover herself, her own interests, her own voice. I watched it all unfold with a quiet, detached satisfaction. There was no joy in his downfall, only a sense of inevitable justice. He had built a life on deception and control, and in the end, he had been undone by the very things he sought to suppress: genuine connection, truth, and the quiet, unyielding strength of those he had underestimated. He had taught me the power of silence, the art of precise execution. And now, he was learning the consequences. The house was quiet again, but this time, it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of resolution, of a debt finally paid.